Okay, so a few weeks ago, I gave 2 talks on getting started with fine tuning. And it was actually David who was at the talks and asked at the end, well, how do you know if you're actually making improvements to your model when you fine tune it? And I was like, oh, that's a really good question. I just ask a couple random prompts and see if it sounds better, and make some lame judgment about it. So I started to look into it, and that's what I want to show today. So I'm going to show a common open source tool, though you can use it on their platform as I am here, and then you can pay a small amount to use it. Or you can use the free version with limited capabilities, but everything is open source. So if you wanted to run it on your own server, you could do that as well. But then I'll show like at the very end, I'll show a hack thing that I did because I was curious, and just doing it in a Google Sheet instead of using a service at all. So first, I'll show kind of what it does. So I set up an account for GW coders, and then within that account, I have 2 projects. So I'll show the second of the projects, which is linked to a chatbot that I presented about actually last April that I built with a RAG component to it. So if I go to the project, you can see I just did this the other night, so it only has 3 things. So they call them traces, but you can think of a trace as being like a unique conversation with an LLM. So if I go into one of these, you'll see it has an input, which is the prompt I wrote, and then it has the output, which is the response that the LLM gave. Okay, let me make that bigger. Maybe not quite that big, like that big. So each trace is basically, you can think of it as one of these. And then it has evaluations that you can do against the traces. It does some other things like these observations and sessions. I haven't gotten that far into it. But the ones that were the most interest to me were, then how do we evaluate each of the conversations back and forth? And we can do human evaluation in the system. So I set up one and I called it demo human annotation, and you can score it on 1 to 10. And when new things come in, they go into my process queue. So I don't have anything new that's in there. So if it is working correctly, so I guess we can demo it as we go. So it's linked to this chatbot. Well, no, not that chatbot, this chatbot. So if I put in a question, and this is if you remember back from last March, this is last April, this is a chatbot designed to answer questions about the topic area of needs assessments, which is where I've done a lot of work, and I had PDFs of writings I could train it on. So what is the difference between needs and wants? We're not really that interested in the response for this part, but it responds to that. And now if I go back to my traces, if I refresh, yeah, now I have 4. If I go to this one, you can see what is the difference between needs and wants, and it should have the same response as I have over here. So this is the LLM response to that. And now what I can do is I can annotate that. So it's in my queue now. So I could look at it, and as a human evaluator, I could give it a score from 0 to 10. And I would say that response is, let's say, a 6. And then, yeah, I don't think there's a submit button. So I think it's just done. Yep, and there it is. It shows I gave it a 6. So you could have people scoring them if you wanted to have human annotators, which you might want to do early on, like right after you fine tune a model, you could have human annotators do it. But as a model gets used more, it would obviously become a burden to have people go in, look at each one and evaluate it. Now that said, that is a lot of what OpenAI and other platforms do early on in the training of their models. They do use human feedback. And the people they have do that are highly trained to do that. Yeah, I was watching a video kind of explaining the reinforcement learning and how they train the people. And they were saying like the OpenAI guidelines for providing responses back for human feedback type things. It's like 100 pages that the people have to know. Very detailed work. And you could go that far too if you wanted to with this. But so that's one way of using the tool to do that. Probably the more interesting way, though, is using LLM as a judge in order to judge each of these responses that comes out. So I built one of these. So with the free account, you can only do one of each of these. Though you could, if you did the paid account, which is like $8 a month or something, you can have as many as you want. And I'll show how you build them after. But it's active. It's done it 7 times. And it is doing one called relevance. And so I have the template for that. And this is what it is literally doing is it has a prompt. And they wrote it and I could make edits to it if I wanted to. And then I tell it which model I want to have evaluated. So I'm going to use GPT-4o, and I put in an API code already, so it knows my API code for charging that. And then I can set temperature output P. And then, so I give it the instructions. It's evaluate the relevance of the generation on a scale of 0 to 1. And then it gives some more. Relevance is determined by the extent to which the provided information addresses the specific question being asked. They use an example that's probably not all that useful. I could probably improve on that. And then down here at the bottom, I tell it, well, what is it going to get? It's going to get a variable called query, and that's the prompt. And it's going to get a variable called generation, and that's the response. And they just have it, they just say, think step by step. Again, I could probably make a lot of improvements to this, but it worked for the first time, so I didn't. And then it will actually do an evaluation of it. So if we go back to the trace and we go to the one that we were just looking at, it gave it a 0 for its response. The generation does not accurately address the query and what is the difference between needs and wants. Yeah, I didn't actually read what the response was, so I don't know if I agree with that, but I'd have to go back and look. You'd have to calibrate it, obviously. For one of the ones I did last night, I guess, or yesterday, it gave it a 0.8. So again, it's on a 0 to 1 scale. It gave it a 0.8 in its recommendation in terms of what was the relevance of that. So yeah, that's a nice way of not having to do it manually. And then you can, they have a dashboard, which you can see, and you can set it up to show you, like, this is just kind of background, but you can also look at performance. So you could see, like, what are your relevance scores? And then you could see how your chatbot is performing on key indicators over time. Now, the nice thing is, if I go into the LLM as judge, so they have some templated ones. So if I add a new one, so these are the ones they've already developed. So like, is it concise? Does it answer correctly? So if you had, so let's say you were using 2 different models, you could have it one check the correctness of the other. You could have it look for hallucinations in it, helpfulness, toxicity, if you were worried that yours was going to go off the rails. Or again, if you were paying for the account, you could run all of them and then just pay for it to do the LLM calls to the other LLM to look at each of yours. So like, if we look at toxicity, you can see, again, it's very similar in that it gives a description of what you want it to do. gives an example. And then actually for this, after the score, it gives the reasoning for the score to help it better generate ones that you would like. But you could also create your own if you wanted as well. So if you wanted to not use one of their templates and you wanted to judge your LLM performance on something else. And if I think back to David's original question, is because we were training one to be a psychologist, was the model that we were training, a llama model. So I could create one that would say, like, how much does this sound like a psychologist? And then have another LLM make a judgment at each time to see. And then over 100 uses of the LLM, I could probably get a fairly good rating to see how well did my fine tuning actually do, or do I have to go back and do another round of fine tuning because it's underperforming on whatever variables are important to me. So to show you, I mean, this is a very easy tool. That's one of the reasons people have been talking a lot about it online. So if I go into, again, this is the chatbot. If I go to the files that run the chatbot, I go into the application, which is actually what makes the whole thing work. I'll make that bigger for those wanting to. So if I scroll down, there's a lot of stuff going on, but here's the important part of this script that I use. So all this is in their documentation, of course. So you set up secret key and a public key for your API to their system. And that then links it to your accounts. And that's how it knows where to put the information when it gets it. And then since I'm using Python, they have decorators, which are great little Python tools that kind of sit in the back end and mean you don't have to write as much code. And since they have it written, it makes it really easy. So I put that code in at the beginning, and then all I really do is I go down to. So this is the function that actually gets the response. So after it does all the RAG pieces, as you might remember, and it does the re-ranking and all those components, when I actually get the final response from the LLM, it comes out of this function here. And all I had to do to get that information to send to them was I had to add this one line, which is the decorator, to the function to say, for this function, I want you to use observe, which it knows is part of line fuse. And that was it. Now, there was a couple other steps, of course, because never in life is code that easy. Because actually, I didn't have this as a function. I had it buried in this code down here below. And so I just had to pull out where it was calling this response and make it a standalone function. So I actually end up calling this function now right here, like 10 lines later. So all I did was move this one line of code up into its own function, and then I called the function because it can't sit with, it can only handle if it gets the information it wants in this function. And as you can see, my longer function had a whole bunch of other stuff in it from our previous presentation. So yeah, and that was it. And that was getting it set up and running. I'll show another example of it where it doesn't work quite as well, or maybe I just haven't figured it out quite as well. So I'm taking a Hugging Face course on developing agents. And so this is actually another chatbot that has an agent associated with it. Sometime I'll present on the agent part because I've learned a lot and it's really interesting how agents work. But I also connected it to LangFuse to see how well it would think my agents were working. So this is, if I put into here, what is the latest research on electric vehicles? and charging. What my agent does, it's a simple agent. It just goes to archive and looks for the most recent articles, and then goes through several steps of logic about those. So it goes through step one, and it's searching archive. I don't know why it's thinking about time zones. It's looking at Google Scholar for something, it appears. Yeah, it goes through several steps. Again, I'm new to agents. I don't quite know. And I know in my code why it's doing it, but I don't know why I want it to do it. That will be probably in our next lesson from Hugging Face. But the important part, that how this plays out and why this isn't as good of an example of it, is if I go to that project, so it's connected to here. If I go to like the last month, can see I've made many calls to it. But what happens is its tracings show each step along the way. So like here is a query. And then if that is the query, then each of the steps is a separate query. And then finally the answer comes in the final step, is where it gives the output. And it says, what is the latest research? Which creates then a problem for this, in that when I give it the code to say, compare the input to the output, well, the input is the prior step. It's not the actual initial query that led to all the prior steps. So I have to figure out how to jump over steps to link the original query to the output, which I could do by putting it into the final output statement. If I went back into the code, I could say, always repeat the query before you give the answer. But that seems kind of hacky, so I'm still trying to figure that part out. But it was pretty easy to set up. So that leads then to the next part of the presentation, which is on, well, WAMs, if you don't want, oh, yep, Cindy?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Before you move on to the next part of the presentation, can I ask like a conceptual question for the evaluation part? So I see you're calling 4.0 as the evaluator, but if we think about like the whole purpose of training or fine-tuning a model is because we think these, foundation models are not sufficient for what we want them to do. So like, why are you asking them to evaluate the fine-tuned model?
So I think that it works because I'm asking a specific question for it to do. So I think where the models can fail us is in the more general. But since I'm asking it to look at what a question was and then look at what the answer is and see if the answer is relevant to the question, I think it can do that task pretty well.
Got it.
Okay. Now, because that's different than just asking, is this like, I guess the correctness one might be harder to do, because then it would have to be able to go to a valid source to find quote unquote ground truth to come back and compare against.
Yeah.
But for something like relevance or conciseness, I'm pretty confident that 4.0 can tell me if a response is concise. Now, whether it can tell if it's correct,
Or it's hallucinates.
my guess is it can do a decent job with hallucinations, because there are some indicators of hallucinations from what I've read. But correctness is the harder one. What I don't know too is I haven't looked as far as like, could you do a second fine-tuned model and call your own model? Because I'm just using like API to go to OpenAI. I assume I could go to like one of my GPTs on OpenAI, which is kind of a fine-tuned model. I mean, kind of a RAG, kind of a special prompt model. But I would assume that I could even call a different model if I was running one on a server with an API somewhere. If I wanted to get really technical, then I could do that.
Or like feed all the human annotation to the LLM and be like, mimic what the human annotators.
Yeah, I mean, you could train it on your human annotation. So if you only had money to pay people for a week to annotate,
Yeah.
if you could get a couple hundred annotations done, you could train a model on that annotation and say, these are good examples of annotations. Do similar to this, and it would probably do a pretty good job of that. If that was relevant to your use case.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thank you.
Oh,
And
no
sorry
problem.
to leave a little bit earlier today. Have another meeting.
Yeah, we're gonna try to get to the 12:30 meeting at Rome too, so we'll
But
try to end a little early here. But the part I wanted to show next was, my wife always says I should say I'm frugal, but I'm cheap. And I don't like the idea of having to pay for something if I could create it myself. So I said, could I just do the same thing, but do it as a Google Sheet instead? Because it's, you may remember one of our other presentations was how to use LLMs in your Google Sheets. So I was like, oh, I could do this as a Google Sheet. So as you can see, I have it set up so that it sends the query and the response now to a Google Sheet. And I can talk about how I set that up. Then what I do here in this column C is I combine the prompt, like the prompt that they had written. So it's their same prompt for relevance. And instead of calling the query like they called the variable, I'm calling cell A3 and cell B3. Other than that, it's the same thing. So all I did was I took their prompt and I put in my variables for it out of my columns that I was getting. And so now if I pull this down, as you can see. Okay, so. Yep, so now you can see it's just pulling all that down. And then if I make that wider, takes up too much room. So now then over in column D, I just have my Ask GPT function. So as you may recall from the earlier presentation, good thing we have all these on video, I guess. So I'm using app scripts. So this is JavaScript and it's interacting with my Google Sheet. So I wrote a function called Ask GPT and the input is the prompt. So over here, I have Ask GPT and I'm pulling that cell C2 over into be that prompt for D2. And then this simply just goes through and it uses the API for OpenAI. I'm using an older model here. I'm using GPT 3.5 Turbo. But I could choose any model that I wanted. Oh, I like that it still has, like in my old notes, you could use DaVinci if you wanted. For those who are old school GPT users, DaVinci was an early model before they moved to the GPT naming convention. Uses my API key, cleans up some stuff that there are errors, and that's really about it. So now when I take my D cells and I take the bottom one and I drag it down to be this one, you'll see it says loading. And it gave it a score of 1 and gave the reason the response directly addresses the query. And I can just do that for each of them. And of course, with this, I could make as many as I wanted. I could do relevance, I could do conciseness. I could also let humans do it in here too, obviously. I mean, it's just a Google Sheet. I could have a Google form link to it. I could, if you go way back to like 2 years ago, we did linking your Google Sheet to your Google form to draw questions. So you can get your questions out of here and then put it into a Google form, have people complete it and have their scores go back into here. So if you don't want to use their fancy interface, you could do all of this on pretty much for free on your own if you wanted to go that route.
Have you compared the scoring? Is it equal to what the interface is suggesting?
Oh, I haven't compared. I guess it would be a little different because I'm using 3.5
Oh, yeah.
and I'd want to change it to 4.0.
So that would be the main difference.
That would be the main difference. I mean, it should be, other than their stochastic,
Because
there'll be slight differences, but yeah, their general should be pretty much the same. If I was using the same model, 3.5 isn't as good as 4.0, so I'd expect a weaker performance with 3.5. Yeah, so does that answer your question, David, of how do you compare to see if it's actually working? And you might be eating, if so, you can not answer, or you may have just disappeared. You left. Yeah, so any questions? Yeah, probably the trickiest part of doing it on the cheap for yourself is figuring out how to get it from your chatbot to your Google Sheet. It's not that bad. There are pretty clear instructions online, but you have to go into your Google Console account and tell it that you're going to use an API to send things to it. So it kind of makes your Google Sheet an API node, so it will receive things by API. And then you can actually send anything you want to your Google Sheets, which is kind of cool to know that like you could move, if you wanted, if you were developing something and you didn't want to have to build a database for it, you could just use your Google Sheet as your database and send it from any application, basically.
This is just a very dumb question.
Yeah.
Google Sheets, are you using a personal account or can you do this with the GW account? Like is the GW accounts locked down such that you can't do this?
So I know you can do the ChatGPT part on the GW ones. I don't know if you can go into the console and get your API, because this is on my personal.
Right.
Yeah, because GW does lock you down for a lot of functions, and I don't quite know why, but IT usually has pretty good reasons for it. If you want me to try, I can try at some point. It wouldn't be that hard. I mean, now that I've done it, I just follow the same instructions over again. But the code, I could show you what the code looks like for doing it, because again, it's.
Yeah, I'm actually like, this is totally unrelated to today's talk, but this reminds me of when you did the, you know, how to do this in Sheets, and I'm thinking like, oh yeah, for my students, I want them to try out different prompts and also document that stuff. And just having all their prompts and their results in a single spreadsheet would be great. Just, it would have a lot of utility.
Yeah, and it'd be much easier than copying and pasting everything over, which would get old real quick. But you could also, I mean, yeah, you could do it really quick where you just have all of them written and then you just send it and like a minute later you have all of your results. And there's.
I think, you know, so we're doing, because I'm in the art school, it's like, it's more, we're using like, you know, text to image.
Yeah.
And so just tracking, like if you're doing prompt engineering, you know, can you start to make sense of what the differences are? And tracking that in a single document as opposed to like, I just have them throw together a slide deck and that's a lot of copying and pasting.
Yeah, I wonder if you could, what would be interesting would be if you could get the images into it as well.
That's my next.
And then move the images to a Google form and that people evaluate them. Like external people evaluate them for you, kind of in a whole automated pipeline. Being very cheap and using all Google products rather. I'm sure there's some product out there that does all that. Yeah, I don't know if LangFuse does anything with non-language, like if you
Right.
can do any image or audio yet.
Yeah,
They're very responsive though. If you went on and asked, they would probably, yeah, and I had questions and like within an hour, I think they're somewhere in Europe, but with like within an hour, they were answering my questions, why something didn't work. So this is the script that pushes it to Google Sheets. So the only thing that's kind of tricky about this is the credential you get from Google is a JSON file. And it really wants the JSON file. So like I thought, oh, I could just take the JSON piece out and put it in as a secret variable and it would read it. But no, it wants a file with JSON. So what I actually do is I have it create, so it's in there, just that JSON script. I have it create a file, put the JSON script into that file, run it temporarily. Once it gets logged in, then I have it delete that JSON file. So it takes my secret code away again. And that's all this is doing. And then it creates a pandas frame to tell it like which cells to put things in. That's how it talks with the Google Sheet, is it creates a data frame and then you can tell it which cells to pass to which cells and they communicate nicely. So yeah, all of it works remarkably well. So. Oh, and David's gone now, so he missed the best part. He'll have to watch the video. And so it was his question that led to all this. Led to me being up late at night trying to figure these things out. Okay, well, if we don't have any questions, I'll go ahead and stop the recording. There we go.